Well, welcome to another Friday night. We've been doing a series on how some of the coping styles that we develop as children because of needing to survive complex trauma actually end up becoming prisons for us. And what happens in adult life is we realize it's a destructive prison. It's hurting ourselves, it's hurting others, and part of our brain wants to get out of it, and part of our brain resists getting out of it because it's their default setting, it's their normal, they know what to do there. And so it's set up all kinds of systems to keep us stuck there. And so a big part of recovery is understanding what these prisons are and then beginning to learn how to change them and get out of them. What I really want you to understand as we do this series is not about shaming people and saying you're bad for being stuck in a prison. You didn't begin the process that got you in a prison. Somebody in authority who abused their authority and ended up abusing you or neglecting you is the one that made it necessary for you to develop these survival coping skills. They started the process, but it's you who's keeping the process going today. And it's you who is the only one who can change the process and get out of the patterns. The responsibility to change is now on you. So you didn't start the process, but you're the only one who can end it. You're the only one who can learn the tools needed to stop it, the tools needed to have better ways of coping, and that's what this series is all about. And so tonight, I want to talk about what for many has become a prison, and that is not trusting anybody, mistrust. And so a child who was repeatedly betrayed by their parents, lied to their parents weren't there for them to meet their needs, their parents were inconsistent in meeting their needs, their parents who broke promises, who kept secrets. How does that affect a child? It erodes trust over time repeatedly and brings a child to a point where they conclude it is not safe to trust anybody. If you trust people, you get hurt. Therefore, they develop a logic. As they go into adult life, it says it's better to only trust yourself, to not trust anybody. So they do that. But then what happens is they can't have intimate relationships because intimate relationships need trust and you need to be able to trust others. And they have all the problems that come out of not trusting somebody else. And so all their intimate relationships are messed up. But then they can't even trust themselves. And so they hurt themselves. And they have a default setting that says, I know how to deal with untrustworthy people. So they're drawn to untrustworthy people. And so then they have all the emotions that come from not being able to connect, not being able to be authentic. And so there's a loneliness and an emptiness that comes out of it. But they're afraid to break out of it because they're afraid to trust. And that happens to so many people from complex trauma. And it's a very painful reality. It's a very painful prison, but it is so important to think through how do we change this prison? How do we get out of it? So let me begin again by giving you a test on, do I have this prison in my life? Do I have mistrust as my go-to, my default? So I'm going to give 10 questions again, and the scoring is 1 if it's completely untrue of you, 2 if it's mostly untrue, 3 if it's slightly more true than untrue, 4 if it's moderately true, 5 if it's mostly true, and 6 if it describes me perfectly. And what we note is if you have a 5 or a 6 in any of the questions, then this could be a real issue for you. So, number 1, I expect people to hurt or use me. 2, throughout my life, people close to me have abused me. 3, it is only a matter of time before the people I love will betray me. 4, I have to protect myself and stay on my guard. 5, if I'm not careful, people will take advantage of me. 6, I set up tests for people to see if they are really on my side. 7, I try to hurt people before they hurt me. 8, I am afraid to let people get close to me because I expect them to hurt me. 9, I am angry about what people have done to me. And 10, I have been physically, verbally, or sexually abused by people I should have been able to trust. So you can score that. 10 to 19 means this life trap probably doesn't apply to you unless you have a 5 or a 6. 20 to 29 might apply to you occasionally. 30 to 39 probably is an issue in your life. 40 to 49 is definitely an issue in your life. And 50 to 60, it's probably one of your core life traps or prisons. So let's do a little deeper dive into understanding this mistrust. So the reality of life is really 2 things. A child, number 1, comes into the world totally dependent. They can't meet any of their own needs, and so in order to survive, they need to be able to rely on somebody who loves them, who is consistently there for them to meet their needs. So trust is essential for survival in an infant. But secondly, as they grow, they discover that true, healthy intimacy, really getting to know somebody, having a loving, meaningful relationship, needs complete trust. If you don't have complete trust, then the relationship is just fraught with problems. And so trust becomes, or is, an important foundation piece of a healthy life. That's the important starting point. But what you begin to realize is trust is my part, but I then need a trustworthy person. If I don't have a trustworthy person, then trust is violated. Trust is eroded. So what makes a trustworthy person? And so a trustworthy person is somebody who is committed to love, who's committed to speaking the truth, being reliable, to justice, to caring for the needs of another person. Now, the problem with that is a lot of people want to be that way, but they have underneath deeper issues that come out of complex trauma revolving around shame. So if you have deep shame and fear, then usually what that does is it drives you or creates in you unhealthy drives. So addiction, greed, a lust for power, a lust for sex, a lust for position. It creates all of these unhealthy drives that the brain as a child thought were going to give you value, thought were going to fix your shame, thought were going to get you respect. So if you have those underlying drives that come out of shame, what you need to understand is that you will be trustworthy to another person. You will love them as long as it doesn't conflict with those more important drives of shame. And so a person who's driven by lust, greed, fear, power, ultimately becomes an untrustworthy person. Because in life, those deeper drives that come out of shame trump love, and they make the person untrustworthy. And so sadly, what comes out of complex trauma for many people is they want to be trustworthy, they want to be loving, but if they've never dealt with their shame and they have this lust, greed, power drives, ultimately they are untrustworthy to other people. They might be trustworthy some of the time, but not all of the time. Now, there's one other piece I need to add about this trustworthiness. A lot of people coming out of complex trauma develop a distorted view of what it means to be trustworthy. And what it basically means is you need to be there for me even when I'm being wrong or unhealthy. So you need to lie for me. You need to keep my secrets. You need to clean up my mess. You need to bail me out of problems. That's being loyal. That's being trustworthy. That's a distorted view of trustworthy. That's basically saying you need to enable me to stay sick and unhealthy and clean up after me. True trustworthiness is I am more committed to truth and being healthy than I am to what you want. And if what you want is unhealthy and conflicts with truth and healthiness, then I'm not going to do what you want. And you're going to accuse me of being untrustworthy, but actually I am very trustworthy because my highest commitment is to truth and healthiness. So that is what makes a trustworthy person. So if a child grows up in an environment where there's many violations of trust, where they've trusted somebody and that person's let them down, betrayed them, lied to them, all of those things, that child will have great damage. If their 12 needs weren't consistently met and they were trusting somebody and needing somebody to meet those 12 needs, there will be great damage. And if that happens repeatedly, a child's hope also gets eroded that there will ever be anybody to trust. And so they go into relationships with a despair, a deep hopelessness that you can ever find somebody who will be trustworthy, that you will ever have a meaningful relationship. So lack of trustworthiness erodes trust, but it also erodes hope, which then affects all future relationships. And so let me bring it a little more specifically into the complex trauma world. So let me say this up front. Complex trauma is not an event, but it comes from multiple chronic, repetitive stressors in life. So it's not a terrifying event, it's a terrifying life. It's a life where your 12 needs are not met on an ongoing basis, where there's danger on an ongoing basis, where you're being hurt on an ongoing basis. So these chronic stressors are largely relational. So complex trauma is a trauma that comes out of intimate relationships. So they're caused by the people closest to you, the people who were there to protect you and meet your needs and care for you are now the ones that are letting you down. The people that you're supposed to be trusting are now the ones that are betraying you. The people that are supposed to be safe are now not safe. That's what complex trauma is about. And so complex trauma involves profound relational betrayal and deception. That is so important to understand. Complex trauma at its heart violates trust. So it's all about violating trust at a deep, deep level. So the people who are hurting you are the ones you thought you could trust. And so for a child growing up in that, it's like a fish swimming in a toxic pond of abandonment, shame, deception, distortion, being used, being blamed, lied to, secrets. You can see how that just overwhelms the child. It overwhelms all their coping mechanisms. And so now instead of putting psychological energy into learning and thriving like a child should be able to do, they have to put all of their energy into survival and self-protection. And the way that they do that is don't trust anybody. As soon as you trust somebody, you're going to get hurt some way because they've been hurt in thousands of ways where trust has been violated. So that is sadly to me that complex trauma messes up this trust area like nothing else. It is just huge. So another way to look at that is this. Complex trauma involves this impressionable, moldable, malleable child who has authorities over them, their parents, their caregivers, who are gaslighting them. They're distorting reality. They're saying it's your fault when it's not really their fault. They're saying you're being selfish when they're not really being selfish. They're gaslighting them. And so they're saying your perception of things isn't accurate. Our perception of things is accurate. So your sense of reality is actually wrong. So you should no longer trust your own thinking. You should only trust what your parents is telling you is the truth. So what is happening is wow, the child is being told not to trust yourself when actually they shouldn't have been trusting their parents. So they go to not trusting themselves and only trusting their parents. But then they realize their parents were lying, and so they can't trust their parents. But the problem is they now can't even trust themselves either. So it's not just eroding their ability to trust other people. What's being eroded is that they can't trust themselves either. And so trust is being destroyed at many levels. Complex trauma causes a person to get stuck there. It becomes a prison. So what comes out of that? 4 things. Number 1, people from complex trauma hate people who are untrustworthy. They despise it. That's what wounded them. That's what they don't ever want to be. But in order to survive complex trauma, they had to lie. They had to keep secrets. They had to betray others. They had to break promises. They had to become untrustworthy. So they had to become the very thing they hated, the very thing that they never want to become because it wounded them so much. And they therefore then hate themselves even more because they had to become this very untrustworthy person. Second, they don't trust themselves. Third, their template in life was to relate to untrustworthy people. That was their normal. That feels familiar. And so now as they go into adult life, they find that they're attracted to untrustworthy people and they get hurt again. And then what comes from that, the 4th thing is, as they go into adult life, they find very trustworthy people, but they don't trust them. They're afraid to trust them. They're afraid they're going to be like everybody else and let them down. And so they end up with no relationships when they have opportunities with some very trustworthy people, but they sabotage those relationships. And so the ramifications into adult life are massive when it comes out of destroying trust as a child. Somebody has said this: their experience of relationships is a painful one. Relationships are not places to relax and become vulnerable. Rather, they are dangerous and unpredictable. People hurt you, betray you, and use you. You have to stay on your guard. It's hard for you to trust people, even the ones closest to you. In fact, it may be particularly the ones closest to you that you are most unable to trust. You assume people secretly mean to harm you. When someone does something nice to you, your mind searches for the ulterior motive. You expect people to lie to you and to try and take advantage of you. So, having said that, let me go a little bit deeper into the characteristics. So we gave you 10 questions to start, but now I want to take it even further for you and give you a whole bunch of characteristics that come out of a person who's had their trust destroyed, has decided not to trust anybody, and now is going into adult life. What can you expect to see in a person like this? So, let's go very quickly through this. You have a deep belief or feeling that people cannot be trusted. That's just there in your subconscious brain. You often feel people are taking advantage of you, even though you have little proof that they are. It's just a hunch all the time. You are reluctant to reveal personal information or show your weakness to others because you worry that they're going to use it against you, because you've been wounded so many times by being authentic. You feel safer connecting to animals than to people. Animals are more trustworthy than people. You would rather do tasks than relate to people. So you like to keep busy doing things rather than do relational things. You feel nervous around people because you worry they will humiliate you. So you're always on your guard. You often feel people have hidden motives or agendas or bad intentions, even when you have little proof. You avoid getting close to people because you won't be able to trust them. And so you always have your guard up. You have walls up. You don't get too close to anybody. You're hypervigilant around friends, looking for some sign of betrayal, dishonesty, hidden agendas. but then you feel lonely inside. There's a deadness that you feel. You feel frozen inside. You need to regularly test people's loyalty. You have difficulty sitting in the unknown, trusting somebody else to be the leader out of the unknown. And so when you're in the unknown and there's a leader, you grill them with questions, with wanting details about what's going to happen. What about this? What about this? Because you can't trust. You withhold crucial information when people ask you for your opinion on a matter. You don't want to reveal too much. You have problems with persistent jealousy as soon as you get in a relationship. You're constantly suspicious of people and therefore always challenging people. You trust all at once when you feel in love, or you just don't trust at all. It's all or nothing. You have a lot of self-doubt and you have a lot of anxiety issues. You either have very needy behaviors or you act like you don't need anybody. You have unrealistic expectations when you get in a relationship of the other person. You expect them to never fail you, to never disappoint you. Those are your proofs that they can be trustworthy. They have to be perfect. So you set the bar way too high for people, which then they're going to fail you. And you go, oh, see, that proves you can't trust anybody. You find fault with everybody, because you're looking to build a case as to why you can't trust anybody. And so you're always finding proof that they're not trustworthy by looking for negative. You are characterized by withdrawal in relationships. So instead of acting carefree, which is what's normal in a trusting relationship, being authentic, spontaneous, you're quite reserved. You don't take risks in relationships. You focus on superficial intimacy as proof that you have good relationships and you trust people. So you're great with guys on the sports team, guys at the bar, all of those kind of settings where it looks like you're really close, you laugh a lot, you do things together, and you'll see that proves I trust people and I have good relationships. It doesn't at all, but that's what you do in your mind. It's interesting that many people that don't trust end up having to medicate the pain that they feel. And so they overeat, they drink too much, they develop other addictions as their way of just trying to fill the emptiness. Many people with trust issues, when they go into relationships, they always have to be the giver. They can never be in the place of need where they have to trust somebody. So they always have to be helping, listening, guiding, but they never admit their own needs. Many people with trust issues, when they get in a relationship, they demand that the other person, in order to prove that they're trustworthy, always be available to help them, to do stuff for them. And so it's kind of like a bird in the nest that has learned how to fly. They've got all the tools, but they're afraid to jump out of the nest and actually fly. And so that now they still demand that their mother do everything for them. And if their mother doesn't, they go, you're not trustworthy. No, mother's very trustworthy. The problem is they're not trusting their ability to use their own tools. So where does this trustworthy come from? We've talked about some of the aspects of complex trauma and home life that will produce distrust. So let me dig into this in more detail. And what I want you to see is that there are hundreds of ways that trust can be eroded in a child. Now, in most cases, if, let's say, a person wasn't there for you and didn't keep a promise, and they did it once, yes, the child's going to be hurt, but you can repair the damage of that by admitting you did wrong, changing, and proving consistently that you keep your promises. So it's not going to cause ongoing damage. It's repairable damage. What happens, though, if a child has trust eroded by a parent telling a lie, keeping a secret, not being there for them, not meeting their needs? But then the parent doesn't repair the damage. They keep on doing it. And it's not just one area, it's hundreds of areas where the parent is not repairing the damage of violating trust, of not doing what they should be doing and the child needs at that time. Great damage. And that, to me, what I hope you're seeing is the profound damage that comes out of complex trauma to trust. It's just massive. Trust eroders, things that destroy trust. You were cheated on in past relationships. You had parents who were promiscuous. So you saw that they weren't trustworthy to each other, and that affected your trust. You grew up in a culture where cheating was the norm and not being trustworthy was the norm, and lying to your friends in order to not hurt their feelings was the norm. So that influenced your thinking. Someone in your family physically or sexually abused you as a child or touched you in an uncomfortable or provocative way. Someone in your family repeatedly humiliated you, teased you, put you down, verbal abuse. People in your family betrayed confidences, exploited your weaknesses to their advantage, manipulated you, made promises they had no intention of keeping, lied to you. That's all within your family of origin. Someone in your family got pleasure from seeing you suffer. And what I want you to see from that is lack of safety. If this person isn't safe, then I can't trust them. You were made to do things as a child by threat or severe punishment or retaliation. One of your parents repeatedly warned you not to trust anybody outside of the family. Take it further. A baby was not responded to when it cried, and it was a legitimate need that was causing them to cry. That can start the erosion of trust at infancy. There were some people in your family that just didn't like you, that were against you. Or one of your parents turned to you for physical affection as a child in a way that made you uncomfortable, or for emotional comfort in a way that was emotional incest. People used to call you names that really hurt. People close to you talked behind your back about you. People close to you refused to accept accountability for their actions, but they blamed you for their troubles, or they blamed others for their troubles. So you begin to realize that's not a trustworthy person, because they're not owning reality. They're lying about it. Hypocrisy. Your family talked a great talk, but they didn't live it. And to the child, well, they're not trustworthy because they're not living by truth consistently. You live in a family where words often had a hidden agenda. So people said the right things. They acted like they loved you and had your best interest in heart. But then you learn that they really were trying to draw you into a net so that they could use you. There was a hidden agenda behind their nice words. You grew up in a family where they cheated at everything to win. They just had to win. You grew up in a family where it was CYA, cover your ass. So they threw everybody under the bus in order to not get in trouble. You grew up in a family where they said nice things to you and said, I love you, but they never showed it with deeds. So their words became empty that you couldn't trust. You grew up with people who only talked about themselves and they never were interested in you. They never asked questions about your life. You grew up in a family where people talked trash and gossiped about others to you. So they talked behind others' backs to you. You grew up in a family where there was lots of manipulation. You've been betrayed in any way. You were abandoned when you needed those people the most. You had families that didn't follow through on promises. And this often happens with children who have a parent who's an addict or has severe mental health, chronic illness issues. You have a family that engaged in excessive secretiveness. There's always little secrets happening. You grew up in a family where nobody ever apologized. You grew up in a family with people who asked for advice, but they never followed the advice once it was given. You have friends, family that betrayed the confidences you shared. You grew up in a family that they had lots of talking about fun things and superficial things, but nobody ever shared deep personal matters of the heart. That was a secret. That was closed off. You have family members that were explosive and unpredictable, temper problems, anger issues. You have families that very impulsive decisions were made based on kind of their limbic brain, what it was feeling at any given time. You have families where it was common to tell lies. Little white lies were excused as being acceptable. When conflict arose, people turned on each other. They didn't try to work it through. It was all about, I have to defeat you, and I don't care how much I hurt you. Family members who put their interests ahead of everybody else consistently. Families where they consistently treated some members better than others. And one that's very subtle but real is a family where they didn't manage their money well. And so they proved they weren't trustworthy with money. Families where there was inconsistency in meeting needs. Some days they were there for you, some days they weren't. Some days they connected, some days they didn't. That erodes trust. Families or relationships where there's porn and you weren't sure that you could trust that person. Families that seemed quite normal until there was stress. And as soon as stress got up, all of a sudden everybody changed, everybody lashed out at each other. Families that didn't persevere when things started getting difficult. It was just they got negative, they quit, they lashed out. Families that were marked by a lot of greed and self-indulgence. It was all about them. Families that were lazy, procrastination, lots of excuses for not doing things, not following through on plans. Families that didn't regulate their emotions. Families that didn't have good boundaries. They were afraid to say no. They said yes to everybody else, but not to you. They flip-flopped all the time on rules, on enforcing boundaries. That just erodes trust big time. Families where there was a double standard. Families where people changed when they were with certain people and then they were different with other people. What I hope you see is like those all look like subtle little things that's not a super big deal, but when you start putting them all together, every single one of them, if it consistently happens over time, erodes trust. Now, I don't know how many of you of those things applied to you growing up, but if 20, 30 of them were part of your life growing up, you had tons of trust eroders that did tremendous damage for you. So you come into recovery now and you go, I want to be trustworthy and I want to build the ability to trust again. What are some of the things you need to watch out for? Some of the dangers. So some come into recovery and they go, I'm not trusting anybody. And I go up front, that's okay at the very beginning. I'm going to give you a bit of time, but eventually you're going to need to learn to trust someone. Once you can find out somebody who's safe and trustworthy, it becomes important to trust because you can't do recovery totally alone. It is not possible. You have to eventually learn to trust somebody. Now that is super hard. But then you get people that come in and they trust too quickly. And so the first person that looks safe, the first person that looks trustworthy, they just trust them totally, and then they usually get hurt again. And it's important to understand that often in recovery, there are those who have a radar for people with trust issues, with people with this life trap. And so they act trustworthy. They give them special attention to garner their trust. They groom them so they can abuse them, so they can use them. So you need to be aware that those kind of predators do exist. So be careful to make sure that the person is trustworthy consistently over a period of time, and don't get drawn into trusting too quickly. One of the things for many people is if they start to fall in love, and it releases oxytocin in the brain. And that makes them think the person is trustworthy. And they jump into trusting too quickly because of the oxytocin effect. So understand this in recovery. A lot of people, I think, have a misconception that they need to go from no trust to 100% trust in one step, all at once. No, that's not possible. It's not healthy. So if you're at 0% trusting people and you eventually want to get to trust somebody 100%, that could take years. And so you're going to go from 0% to 1%. You're going to trust them in a little wee thing. And if they prove that to be trustworthy, you've got a little bit of trust develop. And then you go over time, you trust them a little bit more. You go to 2%, you go to 3%. And over the course of months, you gradually begin to go, this person is more trustworthy, but I don't know if I can fully trust them yet because I haven't trusted them in the really big, important issues. So trust grows very gradually. And that's okay. That's the way it needs to be. And it takes a long time. So don't think you need to go from 0% to 100% as if that's somehow healthy. Accept that rebuilding trust is going to take a long time, and I need to be patient with it. So, having said all of that, let's summarize what is necessary to heal this mistrust prison, this mistrust wound. And I hope you realize that you don't just magically fix this overnight. This is a wound that takes a long time to heal. You got to be very patient with yourself. And it's okay that it takes a long time. Don't get down on yourself that it's taking so long. Have self-compassion in this whole thing, because a lot of damage was done to you at one of the very, very core elements of your life, the need to trust. So for some, you may need to see a therapist. And that's okay. There's no stigma in that, no shame in that. If you've been abused severely, you may need professional help to begin to work through that before you're ever able to begin to even trust at all. Next, work at becoming a trustworthy person. So work at becoming honest, keeping your promises, being consistent, regulating your emotions, not being impulsive, all of those things. Learn kind of the characteristics of what love looks like, what healthy looks like, and just keep growing and being trustworthy. But then grow to trust yourself, to trust your gut, to trust your thinking. That becomes so important, to trust the tools that you're learning. Then build relationships slowly. So as you build relationships, listen to your gut about whether this person is safe. Look for the red flags that would indicate that they're not trustworthy. So is there any betrayal, any lying, any hidden agendas? All of those should be deal breakers for you. Understand that building trust means taking risks. So take manageable risks, little risks. Don't try to take this massive big risk all at once. That's too much to ask. So just take a little risk in trusting a person. And if that proves to work out, then take another little risk. But you have to take risks. And that's going to trigger fear. That's going to trigger all kinds of old messages. And that's why you have to not take too big of a risk all at once, but just take little risks that are manageable. The final thing I want to say is this. To rebuild trust, it's not like you have to trust everybody. You need just one person who proves to be safe, who proves to be trustworthy, that you gradually work on this wound with. So if you can have one person in your life that you can begin to work on this, that's huge. Eventually, you'll begin to find other people that you can trust, but you don't need all of that right up front. You just need to have that one person in your life. Well, I hope what you understand from all of this is going into not trusting kept you safe when you were a child. But now it's preventing healthy relationships. Now it is hurting yourself. Now it is leading to painful emotions of emptiness, of not connecting, of loneliness. So to get healthy, you have to rebuild trust. But it is so scary. It is so difficult to repair all of that damage, but it's possible. That's what I want you to see. It's going to take time. It's going to be a lot of work, but it's worth it. Because when you're able to finally get to a point where you trust yourself, where you have a couple people in your life that you can trust, it leads to a healthy, meaningful, satisfying life. So trust is essential to a healthy, meaning, satisfying life. That's what I want you to see. And I hope this just gets you some understanding and some beginning tools in your journey of rebuilding trust. Well, that's the end of another Friday night. I really hope that helps. I know for many it's going to feel overwhelming and a bit heavy, but I hope it does give you some hope and help.